Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Menashe. Today's episode, we're talking about the myth of taxation. Governments operate under the mistaken assumption that if they create a new tax or new regulation, the population will simply comply. That's generally a good assumption for those who are prisoners of the local jurisdiction. That is, they're not willing to move in order to escape a particular new tax or a particular new regulation. I'm going to use California as an example on today's episode, but I could substitute any high-tax jurisdiction. I could talk about New York, Illinois, or the Canadian province of Quebec. If you live in California and California imposes a new tax, you'll pay the tax. Governments assume that the 40 million people who live in California have chosen to live there and won't leave just because of a new tax. When they look at the census data, more and more people are moving into the state. The population's growing. All is good. But if you're a person of high net worth, you have the financial means to declare your primary residence pretty much wherever you wish. You have the financial means to have true mobility of residence. If you've high net worth, you can afford more than one residence. In fact, if you make enough money, you can buy the new permanent residence in a lower tax jurisdiction just with the tax savings alone and still have money left over. You can keep your original residence and use it as a second home part-time. You won't disrupt your social circles. All of your relationships you've had for years will remain intact. And here's the problem that California faces. Almost half of their $183 billion in income tax revenue comes from 1% of the population. In fact, 80% of their revenue comes from the top 3% of the population. If California loses the residency status of only 1% of their population, their tax revenues could be cut in half overnight. Those people may not actually sell their homes. They may buy a second home elsewhere, which becomes their new primary residence. Let's look at one individual who recently relocated from California to Florida. Tony Robbins used to live in San Diego and more recently in Palm Desert. Today, he lives in Palm Beach, Florida, a place with zero state income tax. Now, I have no idea about Tony Robbins' personal tax situation. He publicly claims to have a $4 billion annual revenue stream. I think it's fair to say he's part of that 1% who pay more than their proportional share of the tax burden for the state. Did he save a ton of money by moving to Florida? I don't know for sure, but my guess is he saved a bunch of money in taxes. He probably paid for his new home with the tax savings. California needs to pay attention. When you go to Miami Beach, you don't hear accents from the southern U.S., even though you're deep in the South. You invariably hear New York accents. Is this an accident? I don't think so. I'm not just talking about the snowbirds who show up during a couple of months of the winter. If you go in the summer months when it's hot and humid, you still hear New York accents. These people are driving their white luxury vehicles, having consciously chosen to live in a lower tax environment. Of course, this is nothing new. Back in the 1980s, when even members of my family had homes in both New York and Florida, they declared Florida as their permanent residence. But today, the states with the highest pension shortfalls are scrambling for ways to raise more revenue. Unlike the federal government, which can print money and try to inflate their way out of a budget shortfall, the states and provinces don't have that ability. The pressure the states are under to solve their budget problems is only increasing as they come closer and closer to their moment of financial collapse. Their mathematical choices are very limited. Number one, they could change the formula, try and tax different aspects of the economy to spread the tax bite a little bit more evenly and hopefully reduce their vulnerability to a single revenue source. Number two, they could create tax incentives that ultimately cause economic expansion and then rely on the higher income base to fund the increased taxes. Or number three, they can cut programs to reduce expenditures. When such a small percentage of highly mobile people hold almost half of the tax revenue in their hands, the states are extremely vulnerable to massive declines in tax revenue as they attempt to tweak the tax code to maximize their revenues and address their revenue shortfall. On the one hand, it's politically unpopular to create more incentives for the rich, but at the moment when you're reliant on them for half your tax revenue, if you don't create the right incentives, they will take their marbles with them and go play the game somewhere else. As you're thinking about that and thinking about where you invest, have an awesome day. Go make some great things happen, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow.